Factoring the greatest common factor, known also as GCF. In this video, we will learn how to factor by GCF. We will learn the definition of factor, of common factor, and also we will work on some examples. So by the end of this video, you will be pretty good at understanding how to find the greatest common factor. So let's start with the definition of factor. The definition of factor is two or more numbers or variables that are multiplied to create a term. So now you have the definition of factor. Two or more numbers or variables that are multiplied to create a term. Let's look at an example. 15. Now, if we want to find a common factor of 15, we know that 3 and 5 are common factors of 15. Now, what about a variable? 7. The variable x to the 7th power has more than one common factor. Example, x to the third power and x to the fourth power. There is another one, x to the second power and x to the fifth power. And the last one, x, which it's simply x to the first power and x to the sixth power. Now, let's talk about the common factor. So we discussed factor. Now let's discuss common factor. So the common factor is simply a shared factor, which is a number or a variable. Example here, we will use 12 and 28, and let's find a common factor. Let's start with number 1. 1 can divide, it's a common factor of 1 and 28. 2 is a common factor of 12 and 28, as well as 3. 3 is a common factor of 12, but not of 428. Next, we have 4 is a common factor of 28 and also 4. And 7 can only divide 8, and 6 only 12, 12 also 12, and 28. Now, the greatest common factor is the biggest number that can divide both numbers. In this case, it's 4. Let's look at one more example. 12 and 15, but let's add a variable to these numbers. Let's add x squared and x to the fourth power. Now let's find a common factor. So the best thing to do first is to find the common factor of the numbers first. Now let's do number 15. 1, 3, 5, and 15 are factors of 15. Now let's find the variable, just like the first problem, x squared, x to the third, x to the fourth. Now let's find the greatest factor, greatest common factor. The number that divides both numbers is 3. And the variable that is common, biggest variable common to both numbers is x squared. Great. Now, as you can see, the GCF for 12 and 15 will be 3x squared. Let's work on some examples now. Let's find a common factor, greatest common factor of x to the fourth, x to the fifth, and x to the eighth. The greatest common factor is x to the fourth. Now, next problem, x and x to the 10 power. As you can see, x is the least number that can divide both numbers, both variables. And the last problem we have, we look at the numbers, and 3 can is the greatest common factor that can divide all numbers, and the smallest variable is x that can divide all three variables. Now let's work on some examples. You can pause the video and practice. So the GCF for the first problem, the greatest common factor that can divide the three numbers is 9. We can easily just look at 18, which is the smallest number, and 9 is the greatest common factor that can divide both. Now the variable, the smallest variable is x squared, which can divide all three other variables. Next problem, finding the GCF. As you can see, 1 is this greatest common factor that can divide 4, 3, and 1. And the variable that can divide all three other numbers, which is common, it's x squared. And for the last problem, as we can see, there are ones in front of the variables, but we don't really need to see them. So let's look at the variables now. We have a, b in all of them, but let's find this greatest one, which is b squared, which can divide all of them. Sorry, a squared and b squared is the two variables that can divide all numbers. And that's how you can find GCF. Now, factoring the greatest common factor. Here is an example. Now that you have understood the greatest common factor, 2 is the greatest common factor of 6 and 14. Now let's divide 6x divided by 2. That will be 3. 3x. Now let's divide 14 by 2, which will be 7. That's how that's how we find the greatest common factor. Now, if we want to check our answer, if our answer is correct, we simply distribute 2 to 3x, and that will be 6x, and 2 times 7 will be 14. As you can see, it gives us back the same answer.